Welcome everyone. My name is Rosamunde van Brakel. I'm a research professor at the Free University of Brussels, and I'm very happy to see all of you for the 5th Surveillance Studies seminar. Before I introduce Azadeh, I would like to make a few announcements, so please keep your microphone muted. We will have time for questions after the presentation. Please wait until after the presentation also to put them in the chat. So you can ask questions in the chat, or you can raise your hand and you can turn on your camera and ask it yourself. The session will be recorded and will be put on YouTube afterwards. Okay. So it's my great pleasure to introduce to you Azadeh Akbari, who is academic staff, a postdoc at the Political Geography Working Group at the University of Münster in Germany. Her research conceptualizes surveillance as spatial injustice through case studies of surveillance of urban and cyberspaces in Iran. She received her PhD in human geography from Heidelberg University and her Master of Science degree in gender research from the London School of Economics and Political Sciences. Azadeh was a journalist, feminist activist, and a communications specialist employed by different UN agencies and international organizations in Iran. She is also the founder of the Surveillance in the Global South Research Network. And now I will hand over to Azadeh. Welcome.
Thank you very much, and thanks a lot for this invitation. I'm very excited about it. I'm looking forward to the discussion afterwards. As you said, I've done my PhD project in Heidelberg University in human geography, and what I'm presenting today is actually my PhD project. It is inclusive of 3 overlapping areas, 3 overlapping research questions, and I have published 3 papers. 1 book chapter is coming out in August this year. I'm posting these papers in the chat in case you're interested to know more in detail what the discussion is about. You can definitely refer to the paper. This entire project, before I start presenting, was set up by a personal experience. As Rosamund said, I used to be a journalist and a feminist activist in Iran. In 2008, a year before the 2009 uprising, I went through interrogations for a year, and throughout these interrogations, although we all knew, I figured that my phone is being tapped, and every movement that I make is followed by the GPS of my mobile phone. So in every interrogation session, it was also asked if I can confess, what kind of relationship I have with the people that I talk to, and how do I know these people, and questions about people that I had talked to them on my phone. So out of concern, I stopped calling my friends and all my social contacts. And you would think that social relationships are stronger than that, but actually, really, if you don't call people for a year, people start forgetting you. So apart from all this things that are said about surveillance, I became interested how surveillance changes people's daily lives. What happens if you know that you're under surveillance? And this personal project became a PhD, personal question became a PhD project. So today I'm going to, I hope you see everything well. Okay. If not, please give me a shout. And as I said, this personal question became a PhD project, and the questions were how surveillance influences people's daily practices. What subjectifying effects does it have to know that you're under surveillance? What are the ethical predispositions of surveillance? What criteria distinguish good and bad surveillance? How do technologies travel to the global south? Interestingly, the technology that was used to tap my phone was bought from the Nokia Siemens company. And a year after, in 2010, an Iranian political activist actually for the first time sued a company for selling technology that could be used in human rights violations. So who are the gatekeepers of these technologies? Who are the watchdogs? What are the spatial characteristics of surveillance? So although surveillance was happening in the digital sphere, I felt the consequences in my daily life in the very physical space of my movements in the city. Then I asked my questions, what kind of politics is enabled, precluded, or imagined by surveillance technologies? And I started to read more surveillance theories and surveillance studies books. And then I asked myself why my experience was not reflected in the universal approach of surveillance studies. So the question became, how can surveillance be formulated in a way to include some of these aspects? Before theorizing surveillance or criticizing the current literature, it was important for me to understand how the surveillance assemblages function through boundaries, borders, platforms, spaces, nodes, and networks. So in the tradition of geographical discipline, I started exploring. And this exploring happened in a method called following things. Follow the thing is a phrase coined by anthropologist Arjun Appadura in 1988, and then expanded by another anthropologist, George Marcus, in 1995. Both encourage a kind of multi-sited anthropology that would research how people's lives are intertwined through and among other factors such as trading, purchase, use, distribution, and disposal of things. Jan Cook, a professor of cultural geography, famously followed papaya. This is a very classic paper in geography and in anthropology. He followed back papaya into Jamaica. And there he looked at the farm workers, the distribution channels, how exotic fruits would be marketed in the United Kingdom. And this became a trend at the time. So people started to follow everything. They followed sugar, coffee, bananas, batteries, ballot shoes. And this is a website that Cook has started, followthethings.com. I use it all the time with my students. It's a very good tool to use it in the classroom. And people started to follow things that they were very slippery to follow, such as money. I thought to myself, it would be interesting, what is the thing that is moving between this network of surveillance? And I thought it's data, actually. But following data is really difficult because it doesn't quite fit economic definitions of regular commodity. Data is non-rival. Firstly, many people could use it at the same time. People who produce data still own it, but so does the platform owners, marketing agencies, and surveillance organizations. It is hard to standardize data as a commodity or to define its quality. And data lacks fungibility as its units are not interchangeable. So data production transcends the boundaries of so-called local and global. And despite all that, extracted data used for advertising made 90% of Google's and 97% of Facebook's revenues in the first quarter of 2016. So there is something there. We cannot really say it's a commodity, but it's making revenues. How can we theorize data? And there are many approaches to define what a thing is. For example, Marxist approaches aim to defetishize consumer products by following them back in the commodity chain to the production point. And they follow the thing's journey from producer to consumer, but this is a very linear understanding of this journey, and they focus mainly on exchange value. And therefore, it's this approach is difficult in understanding data's constant movements in and out of the commodity cycle. So in a moment, data could be a commodity, could be exchanged, but another moment, data is completely useless. It cannot be defined as a commodity. So I looked at cultural studies, and they emphasize on the use value and an object's meaning in different regimes of value. That's a very interesting approach, but both approaches, despite their political importance, they mainly focus on things and follow things from the south to the north. And these things, interestingly, remain traceable, whole, and stable, and do not fall into gaps that make them unfollowable. So I thought what is really interesting in data and surveillance technology is that they could be understood through associations. And therefore, I used actor network theory, and I contended data as an object, as an actant. And in this framework, you follow an object's traces through associations and transformations without any a priori theoretical concepts. So you don't have universal theories to understand something. You just really follow something through associations or the traces of a thing. So I thought, okay, I follow a video from an Iranian user who is trying to post this video on Facebook. And I followed actually something really specific, a video that I tried to post during 2009 uprising in Iran, and I couldn't do it because the speed of my connection was really low, and then my VPN services were not working. So imagine yourself, you're an Iranian user, you're sitting in front of your laptop and you want to post a video on Facebook. Most of the theories of data, capitalism, surveillance capitalism, whatever, they start from this moment. But what was interesting for me was what's happened before this moment, what kind of journey data takes to reach Facebook servers at the beginning. So I started with the internet connection. The internet entered Iran first for academic and scientific purposes in 1993 through the Institute of Studies in Theoretical Physics and Mathematics. After the first appearance of private internet service providers in 1994, access to the internet became possible to people outside academia. The new technology entered the market almost without any limits on the content, but its democratic life did not last long. In 1997, the reformists won the presidential election, and in 1999, there was a huge uprising of university students in Iran. And the role the internet played in mobilizing people and facilitating an open political discussion alarmed the Iranian regime. You should also bear in mind that internet emerged in a society that all radio and TV stations were and are state-owned, and owning a satellite dish was and is illegal. So not long after the uprising, the supreme leader of Iran issued a decree concerning general policies of information and computing networks that initiated organized filtering of internet websites up until today. Following the decree, the Supreme Council for Cultural Revolution declared in 2001 that ISPs must remove anti-government and anti-Islamic sites from their servers, and that all internet service providers should be placed under state control. So currently, all local ISPs must buy bandwidth from the telecommunications infrastructure company, and it is the only company that has exclusive rights to buy internet bandwidth for Iran. But internet connection is not the only physical feature of access to the internet that is strictly regulated. For a long time, private users only had a limited internet connection with a speed of 128 KB per second. These speed limits are removed since 2015, but during the times of political unrest, internet speed is something that the Iranian regime plays very well with, and they reduce it in a way that people cannot share news or post videos. So these are, if you think these are like the hard infrastructure that is controlled in Iran, but there's also soft elements to it. So for example, in addition to blacklisting complete URLs, the telecommunications infrastructure company uses an invasive system of keyword filtering and monitors each user's IP traffic. So if you, for example, search breast in Iran, and if you have breast cancer and you want to know more about breast cancer, most probably you would see just a page that says, oh, sorry, the address you're looking for is not available. When a particular person, group, or topic is targeted, the inception methods become more intrusive. For example, deep packet inspection is used as a method, and it is already revealed that Iran has bought really modern technologies from China that uses specifically DPI technologies. Other active eavesdropping methods, such as man-in-the-middle attacks, are also employed. And Google officially acknowledged, for example, SSL man-in-the-middle attacks in 2011. Similar attacks were reported to access users' data at Yahoo and Skype. And generally, SSL blocking is considered as a second wave of internet blocking in Iran. It is not the usual passive act of censorship. It rather targets the very security of internet users. So during this time, I received a few alerts from Gmail that somebody is trying to break into my emails. And this was not something just targeted on me. A lot of political activists and other activists are targets to the Iranian cyber army. And this cyber army was established in 2005 by Iran's Revolutionary Guards. It's an underground network of pro-regime cyber activists, hackers, and bloggers that monitor the internet and launch cyber attacks on the opposition and anti-Islamic websites. Apart from its internal mission, the cyber army has also launched attacks against Voice of America, Arab energy firms, Twitter, US financial institutions, and similar. The other more local cyber police, established in January 2011, tackles cyber crimes such as online scams or fraud. And you can imagine if you're an activist, there is an atmosphere of distrust in Iranian cyberspace because you're never sure the person who is commenting is a member of cyber army or not. So it's not a very friendly atmosphere. Here I also want to highlight some of the laws and regulations that paved the way for such surveillance measures. As I said at the beginning, ISPs regularly receive lists of websites. Literally, lists of websites used to be faxed to ISPs that should have been manually filtered. In 2002, the Iranian parliament passed a law that determined guidelines for identifying criminal internet activities. And a year later, a committee was established. And in 2006, the conservative government of Ahmadinejad required all Iranian websites to register at the Ministry of Culture and Islamic Guidance. And you could not be online active if you had not this registration number. Later in 2009, the Iranian parliament passed the computer crimes law and established a working group to determine the instances of criminal content again. And it's quite interesting to see what is considered criminal in this law. And this is content against public morality, content against sanctities, against public security and peace, against public and government officials and organizations, so much for the freedom of speech, and content to facilitate computer crimes. So you would think, okay, there's enough now, there's hard surveillance, there's soft surveillance, there are laws and regulations. Despite all that, in 2012, the Supreme Leader ordered the establishment of the Supreme Council of Cyberspace, and the Supreme Council is responsible for general policies regarding the cyberspace. And many of these members are similar to the working group to determine the instances of criminal content, but the Supreme Leader appointed 7 members directly to better control the governance of cyberspace in Iran. As you can see, this is a very, very important issue for the Iranian regime. So it is being directly supervised by the leader himself. But despite all these supreme councils and the supreme leader, the supreme people of Iran also do not sit silent against all this surveillance measure. They use a lot of VPN technologies. So VPN technologies, I think everybody is familiar with it, but it is a way of sort of hiding your IP address when you're browsing the internet. And to give you an idea, most of the social media platforms in Iran are filtered. So you don't have any access to YouTube, to Facebook, to WordPress, and similar websites. So many users try to access the global internet through the free VPN services provided, interestingly, by Western news agencies such as BBC Persian, Euronews Persian, Deutsche Welle Persian, Radio Freedom, Voice of America, and similar. These VPN services are available as part of these organizations' mandate to defend freedom of expression. And you can see here how the global layer is affecting people's connection to the internet at a very, very local level. These VPN services provided by these Western news agencies are mainly procured by Siphon. It's a Toronto-based company producing open source multi-platform software used by 3 million people to connect to the internet. And it's very simple. You send them an email and you receive a link to download the application. Siphon was established in collaboration with Article 19, a British human rights organization with a focus on freedom of expression. And you might think now, okay, great, at least there is a way for people to have access to free internet. But Siphon claims that people have, 3 million people have access to free internet through its services. But a national survey by Iranian Ministry of Youth and Sports has officially announced that 70% of Iranian youth between the ages of 15 and 29 use circumvention technologies. And just to give you an idea, 50% of Iranian population is under the age of 35. So it is a big chunk of population. It's not a small number. Such extensive use of circumvention tools is also despite the punishments foreseen in the law, in the 2009 cybercrime law. And despite many reported cases of arrest for the sale and distribution of VPN services, users download anything to have access to the global internet. And most of these VPN applications are uncertified and unidentified, and they have no privacy policies. And there is an interesting gray area that you might think, okay, a lot of these people who provide these applications, doesn't matter if they come from a security organization from any country, it could be any country, and they would have access to Iranian users' data, but also the Iranian security officials, interestingly, produce these VPN applications. So an Iranian newspaper really followed up the case and saw that many of these VPN providers have online payment options that are only possible if you have an authorization from the Iranian central bank. And the question is very valid. How could you be running an illegal service if you're not supported by the security officials? And this is partly true because there are exclusive rights in for a lot of telecommunication infrastructure companies. For an ISP company, you need security clearance from the intelligence officials, and this is very much ISPs are very much owned by people who used to work in intelligence systems. So these were the things that were kind of reactionary to what happens globally, a kind of reactionary internet governance, but it's not all of it. One of the things that is really worrying all Iranian activists is the establishment of the national internet network in Iran. So basically this national internet network is a national intranet that separates the national internet traffic from the international internet traffic. And they use a lot of encouragement and a lot of incentives to sort of establish this national internet network amongst people. So for example, you would pay less, you would have better speed, and you have much easier browsing experience if you're using the national internet. Iran also uses a lot of replacement platforms. So we have the Iranian version of YouTube, the Iranian version of Facebook, the Iranian version of every social media platform that you can imagine. So these are some of the proactive policies that the Iranian regime uses to govern the internet. So for me, this was following one piece of video started to open up all these layers of institutions, policies, code, and everything that is sort of hidden away when we are just talking about data. And for me, it was interesting that following data shows what kind of surveillance assemblages are in place. And what I have talked about are a few examples of how data conjures up movements of things, people, and technologies globally, and how these movements have political consequences. And as I said, without accounting for the experiences of people in the countries of the global South, I don't think that a collective framework of data justice can be drawn. We talk a lot nowadays about data justice, but without the experiences of people in the global South, I don't think that this framework would be very inclusive. Data injustice lies in an uneven matrix of injustices, and any discussion about it cannot neglect neither the topology of injustices nor their intersectional nature. My critique also reflects on our role as researchers who actively shape the reality by portraying data as a singular, universal object. Following the traces of an unpublished video reveals an intricate assemblage of organizations, policies, laws, codes, software, people, and platforms that could be shunned as a nuance, an example of undemocratic governance of the internet. And that's what we hear a lot. There is a lot of undemocratic governance of internet. However, this thing narrates by no means an exceptional life for the data produced in the global South. And although these grand theories of data capitalism give us political tools to combat the growing profit-oriented attainment of data from users, I think failing to understand the dynamics of data's journey will produce a naturalized, homogenized, universal image that leaves many realities of data out. So this entire exploration experience was interesting for me because it sort of sheds light on the spatiality of surveillance. And by spatiality, I mean here the morphing of the global and the local, the physical and the virtual. You cannot talk about either or. It's happening at the same time. They are morphed into each other. And also the politics of surveillance. And politics not in a sense that it is formulated in the nation-state politics that we are used to, but rather understood through relations of power and unequal relations of power. And as I have already explained, I also, it was important for me to have this critique against the universality of surveillance theories. So as a geographer, all these aspects sort of were summarized interestingly in the idea of spatial justice. Excuse me. For those of you who are not coming from geography, the theorization of spatial justice has been mainly rooted in Marxist urban studies. The concept was first introduced by Henry Lefebvre, the so-called father of 1968 students' movement, in his book, The Right to the City. Lefebvre contended that capitalism generates geographies that would ensure its survival through the reproduction of the social relations of production. A lot of words, basically, he says that space is produced socially. This link between capitalism, surplus production and use and urbanization continues to be highlighted in the works of next generations of like-minded geographers. David Harvey, for example, introduces the concept of spatial fix to describe how capitalism survives the crisis of over-accumulation through geographical expansion and geographical restructuring. Apart from its links with capitalism, another occurring theme in the works of this group of geographers is dialectical relationship between the social and the spatial. And this dialectical relationship was very interesting for my project. For them, the space is not just a container of the social, they are dialectically intertwined. So each of these thinkers have majorly changed our understanding of space, but in their work, they all engage only with urban spaces. We have now emerging discussions about environmental justice, for example, and they talk about landscapes and the nature in this environmental justice discussions. And there are a few papers on the right to the village, but most of the other theories are mainly focused on urban spaces. But surveillance doesn't happen just in urban spaces, and therefore I needed to revisit the concept of space. The theorization that these thinkers of spatial justice also mainly relied on Marxist approaches to the question of justice and focused on class and justice in means of production. And although Marxist geographers all criticized distributed justice for its social stratification based on income and negligence of concepts such as class, they remained themselves reluctant to the questions of race, gender, etc. Marxist theories of justice also was not analytically suited for the tensions between the local and the global in a highly globalized world, as it majorly engaged with capitalism at a macro level. So I also needed to revisit the concept of justice in a way that it could match today's realities, but also to contain local struggles and to understand the links between the local and the global. So in my revisiting of the concept of space, I use actor network theory. Here I have listed ANT's main concepts. Firstly, relational materiality argues that entities take their form and acquire their attributes as a result of their relations with other entities. If we follow that line of argument, then entities are also performed in, by, and through their associations. And finally, ANT gives agency to non-humans or to things as they can transform their associations. So why ANT? It was interesting to see if you start seeing everything through associations, ANT can also be formulated as geography of associations. It also takes universality inside out so that the global is already included in the local, their association is there. The mutual constitution of local and global is also extendable to the relations between virtual and physical space. This is extremely useful when one wants to explain the concurrent and interrelated relation between different spaces of surveillance. ANT also highlights the central role of movement and how concepts and things travel in space. This has a major theoretical capacity to show how technologies, surveillance regimes, and cyber resistance ideas move. I have elaborated thoroughly on this understanding of space in my paper that is published in Antipod. So if you're interested in thinking about space through ANT, you can definitely refer to that paper. And as I said, I also wanted to revisit theories of justice, and I have used mainly two theories of justice. The first one is Iris Marion Young, and she transcends the notion of class and extends the issue of justice to social groups and their privileges. She develops a theory of justice based on the questions of oppression and domination. And for her, domination is something that is very much related to the lack of participation. And that's a very nice bridge to the next theory from Nancy Fraser. She talks about abnormal justice, and she argues that the what, the who, and the how of justice are contested in today's global world. She defines the normative principle of parity of participation, and basically she says, if people cannot participate in the political, economic, or sociocultural aspects of a situation, that situation is not just. She also proposes the old subjected principle, meaning that all those who are subject to a given governance structure have moral standing as subjects of justice in relation to it. This is a very modern understanding of justice, postmodern understanding of justice, very new understanding of justice, because, for example, it takes out understanding of justice out of political systems, and it relates to today's global reality. So, for example, she argues we have a moral standing against Google, Facebook, and all these companies because we are subject to their governance structure. This is an interesting way of thinking about how our relationship with these companies could be regulated. And more importantly, Nancy Fraser's theory gives us this tool to think, okay, if people cannot participate in a situation, that situation is inherently unjust. And this is a very political understanding of justice. So I'm going to elaborate on all these very theoretical concepts through a case study of surveillance in urban spaces in Iran. And this research was intrigued by a tweet. In the tweet, it says, this is not a milk or bread queue. All these people are at Murad Security Police Station because the driver of their car has had improper hijab. Recently, improper hijab is being captured on CCTV cameras on the road. This immediately captured my attention because I consider compulsory hijab as an issue of spatial injustice, which deprives women from accessing public spaces, limits their freedom of movement, affects their feeling of security and well-being in public, and gravely restricts their participation in different aspects of social life. So just to give you an idea of why I think compulsory hijab is a case of spatial injustice, I'll give you some background information about the regulations on hijab. Just a year after the victory of Iranian Revolution, women were banned from entering governmental and public service buildings without hijab. In 1983, with the ratification of the Islamic punitive law, not having proper hijab in all public places was considered an offense, punishable with 74 lashes. The punishment was later changed in 1997 to 10 to 60 days of imprisonment or a fine. All throughout these years, street patrols of revolutionary committees played an important role in harassing women who were deemed not properly covered. By the ratification of the new Islamic punitive law and disbanding of committees in 1993, police forces were then legally required to arrest women who disobeyed the compulsory hijab law. This commenced police surveillance of women in all public spaces of Iran until today. In addition to police forces, public spaces such as parks, streets, and public transportation, every university, hospital, government office, public service bureau, shopping mall, and similar is staffed to control women's clothing. And these stickers are everywhere. So on this sticker it says, "We are sorry, but we cannot host you here if you're not having proper hijab." So a very short background about surveillance in Iran. Also, surveillance entered the Iranian daily life after the controversial presidential elections in 2009. CCTV cameras became compulsory in cafes, universities, and even in kindergartens. Traffic control cameras mushroomed in big cities, and although it was publicly announced that police and security forces could only have access to footage of these cameras upon judicial requests, it was revealed in 2015 that the entire country's urban CCTV cameras transmit their footage to the headquarters of special police forces who are mandated to deal with insurgency. So one of the overlaps happening between these two regimes of controlling space was when in June 2017, it was announced that women who do not properly cover their hair while driving are legally persecuted and their cars are impounded. And in December 2017, all these rumors came out in Twitter that people are the police is using traffic cameras to identify improper hijab. So here you can observe not only the male gaze, but also an active masculinization of space, where the traffic data is used for other purposes, such as surveillance, sorting, disciplining, and punishing women. So the question is that possible? I really don't think that Iran is not yet so technologically advanced to possibly have that kind of facial recognition that would pick up improper hijab while driving. But this is definitely a threat of automating control in a society that is controlled very strictly. Here is a picture of a software that I wanted to show you. And this software is used in Iranian national TV, and here they manually train an algorithm to detect abnormal scenes. So here you can see cleavage is tagged as abnormal and is going to be censored in that TV series or whatever that is going to be aired on TV. So they are working on a lot of AI options for censorship and control. And this is this threat of automating control when it comes to traffic data is not that far from imagination. So you might ask yourselves, how is that possible? Is it possible that such a large group of people would be under surveillance? And it seems practically impossible. But in 2017, 207,000 women undertook written promises to correct their behavior, while 18,000 women were sent to court. And in response, an anonymous group of activists created Gershad, a collective mapping application that allowed users to pin moral police patrols on the map. I'm going to show you a video. The developers of this application won a prize from Deutsche Welle in Germany. I don't have the rights to this video. I'm going to post the link to it later on, but if you're going to refer to it, please refer to the German Deutsche Welle website.
Says dealing with the market is still very demeaning and unpleasant experience for anyone, especially for young women. Have to worry about how they dress.
So this is one of the reactions that people showed to surveillance in urban space through digital means. Another recent development is the White Wednesdays campaign that encourages women to walk in public spaces without headscarves, film the walk and possible confrontations, and post it on social media. The videos have caused heated national debates, and the number of anonymous participants is growing by the day. The White Wednesdays campaign stands not only as a claim to physical space, but also occupies digital space by publishing its own narrative of how space should be organized justly. The videos also act as returning the gaze of surveillance and its normalizing effect on women that have been systematically controlled, surveilled, and criminalized. So these two women, for example, are walking in a very small town in Iranian Kurdistan. And just to give you an idea, this is not something that you could play lightly. A 21-year-old activist of this campaign was sentenced to 24 years of imprisonment, I think 2 years ago, because of her actions against national security. So this is something very sensitive. As you can see here, these photos again are from the Instagram page of White Wednesdays campaign. If you're going to refer to them, please refer to the Instagram page. I don't have the copyrights of these photos or the video. This woman is, for example, dancing to street musicians in the days before the Iranian New Year in Tabriz. This woman is singing for a public audience. These ladies are riding bicycles in the city of Isfahan, and all these things that you see, they are all illegal. So singing for women has been illegal for 41 years. Dancing is in public spaces is unimaginable. And riding bicycles is very problematic, especially in this city, because there's a very conservative militia group in Isfahan that actually did acid attacks against women just to prove a point and sort of to make an atmosphere of fear for women who dare to resist this kind of controlling of space. And more interestingly are the school children and school girls that are sending photos to this campaign. And children, like girls in Iran, have to wear hijab from the age of 7. Religiously speaking, they have to do it from the age of 9, but the argument is that they have to get used to it. So we used to have, and people still have hijab from the age of 7. And this is the kind of resistance that they are showing. So I did a thematic analysis of Gershad's Twitter account and White Wednesday's campaign Instagram account. Here you see the thematic analysis of Gershad's Twitter account. And interestingly, there's a little bit of commentary on hijab, but interestingly, 16% of the tweets contribute to the more general political discussions in Iran, specifically those that question the undemocratic nature of ideological imposition on people, such as police violence against people who publicly eat or drink during the month of Ramadan. It is also interesting that Gershad has integrated a VPN connection into the application and not only tries to resist against the unjust configuration of urban space, but also concurrently encourages free access to the cyberspace. The right to the city here in White Wednesday's campaign entails more substantial political elements, which problematize not only hijab in public spaces, but also the dominant discourses on female bodies, women's role in the family and society, and their public engagements. Harassment in public spaces and acid attacks also emerge as themes that highlight not only women's lack of access to public spaces, but also the violence they experience trespassing established boundaries. Among the videos of women's confrontation with people opposing their hijab-free strolling, most videos depict confrontations with religious people. The videos demonstrate a larger ongoing debate at the public level about the religious justifications of ideological organization of space. Most of the videos in this category are hashtagged with "my camera, my weapon," underlining the act of resistance by reciprocating the violence with returning the gaze of surveillance. Another layer that is interesting in the White Wednesday's campaign is that the leader of this campaign met with Mike Pompeo, for example, during Trump's administration in the United States. And it was a very difficult situation for a lot of feminist activists to invite in that kind of international politics that are very much uninvited to our local resistance against controlling of female bodies. So you see how the global and local levels are very much overlapping in cases of surveillance, and not only spaces of virtual and physical are overlapping, but a lot of political connections and associations are active in our understanding of this surveillance assemblage. So I have tried to have a spatial approach to the question of surveillance. There was an interdisciplinary multi-actual spatial justice framework, and I have applied this spatial justice framework to physical and virtual spaces. So it's not only the physical urban spaces, but also the digital space of a data bank or a chat room or the entire space of the entire cyberspace. And in that sense, I have tried to politicize surveillance very much and put it into a very matrix of political injustices. And more than anything, I have hoped that I have developed some new geographical and data imaginations that, as I said, this is the geographical imagination has been tried to be approached through following things. And by following data, I hoped that I have developed a kind of data imagination that is not alternative, but completes these universal theories of data governance and data justice. So I'm going to talk more probably in the question and answer section. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Azadeh, for this fascinating presentation. For people who have questions, please raise your hand or put it in the chat. And while that is, I think there's already someone. Yeah, Johannes, go ahead. Turn on your camera and ask your question. You need to unmute your mic.
Oh, sorry, that was very impressive for presentation. I just have several questions. The first question is, you were talking about data justice and the global south, right? So in a sense, minorities, dissidents, women in Iran, they're like in a double disadvantaged position, right? They are like dissidents in the global south. And at the same time, you have the Iranian regime, which probably tries to justify its actions sometimes as a resistance against US cultural hegemony. And I just wonder where dissidents stand regarding this like difficult confrontation. Another question would be, you worked also on the comparison between Russia and Iran. And I just wonder whether that's possible, whether you can sketch the differences between the Iranian mode of surveillance and Russian and Chinese mode of surveillance and internet control. I guess that's it for now, but yes, very great presentation.
Thank you very much. So I tried to highlight these two case studies as two maybe ways of digital resistance against the injustices that are experienced, in this case, particularly by women. But there are a lot of cyber activists in Iran, and they do all sorts of projects. At the moment, a lot of focus is obviously on this national internet network, because it would really cut out people of Iran from accessing the global internet. So a lot of focus is in that area. It's an ongoing discussion, but I found these two examples some really creative and interesting ways of dealing with this question, how you could digitally resist in a very controlled cyberspace. About Russia, in that paper, it was also interesting that we looked at platform governance regarding Telegram, and we compared Iran and Russia. And as I said, in 2010, for example, an Iranian political activist sued Nokia Siemens company for selling technologies to Iran. And it went on. He dropped the case at some point, but the Nokia Siemens company actually apologized at the end. And in one European Commission sitting, their representative said that the responsibility lies with the people who use the technology. But that kind of mentality has changed a lot, I think. And consequently, European Union actually ratified regulations for selling technologies to countries like Iran. The thing that happened immediately, Chinese firms and Chinese companies replaced the European and American companies. And Huawei, for example, has been a big supporter of surveillance technologies in Iran. And Iran is very much inspired by internet governance models in China and Russia. So you would see that a lot of legislations and a lot of policies are very much inspired by the Chinese model. So Iran is, for example, at the moment developing a central digital identity system, which is very dangerous because they are going to link this digital identity system with a national internet network. And it means that you log in with your digital identity and everything that you do online is going to be followed up, which is very close to the Chinese system, for example. But they also, for example, this entire regulations about controlling the cyberspace, cyber activities against national security, you see that there's a very similar touch with the regulations in Russia. So these countries also sort of feed each other in creatively thinking how to keep going with their authoritarian way of governing internet and internet access. But definitely the cultural and infrastructural and technological possibilities in each country is determining how these policies are playing off at the end of the day.
Okay, Johannes, you don't want to respond on?
Yes. I actually, if I have the possibility, I would like to ask, when you say those countries inspire each other, I would think of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, of which, for example, Iran and India are members since 2017. That would be interesting there. Or another question would be, how transnational surveillance work, whether Iran only does surveillance within its own territory, or whether, for example, dissidents who are abroad, like maybe you, are also victims of surveillance.
That's a very good question, and that's why I think these political theories based on nation states and on the borders cannot really depict a realistic picture of today's surveillance regimes. To give you some examples, for example, a lot of Iranian leftist activists live in Sweden, and I would say they are the biggest leftist community of Iranian political activists. Recently it came out that a Farsi teaching application for children, which is teaching second, third generation of Iranian immigrant children in Sweden, is using spywares on the telephones or the tablets of the parents. So these are some really creative ways that they try to spy on people. I was very traditionally interrogated, really in an interrogation room and everything, but they are using really more creative ways of surveilling people. And it's not only Iran, it's like, as you said, it's a very transnational network of surveillance. So for example, as I said, the VPN technologies, VPN applications that are downloadable in Iran, they are not only from the security officials in Iran. You can imagine any intelligence system in any country that is interested in Iranian users' data can make one VPN application available and basically can really monitor every single move of Iranian users' data. That's the kind of data that is really precious for a country that you don't really have any information about it. So this is something that is, it is very transnational.
Okay, another question. Stephanie, please put on your camera if you like and ask your question.
Hi. Sorry, can everybody hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, good. So I just wanted to ask, so where my question comes from, as you said, it's doubtful whether or not Iran is even far enough technologically to be able to detect, for example, improper hijab in driving cars or otherwise. Plus, and correct me if I'm wrong, because I've only spent a few months in Iran, but I feel like tourists are treated much more leniently as far as the way that they put on hijab. And I've never seen them being like put aside by morality police, especially in cities like Tehran, Yaz, Shiraz, Isfahan. They're very touristic. So that would all make the matter even more complicated. My questions are thus, are these plans and implementations then more symbolic, like meant to be symbolic from the government out? Or do you think that this is more like a case of like net widening where they want to or they will treat everybody more strictly, even those who are not Iranian?
To be honest, as I said, I don't really think that they are technologically so advanced, or I don't even think that they would want to do something like that. You have to also consider that it's a source of income. So if you compound all these cars with a reason, and not having proper hijab is a very good reason. So even in that tweet, you see all the people who are standing in the queue, they are men. You can partly say, okay, most of these cars are owned by fathers or husbands or anything, but part of it is this economic advantage of using hijab as an excuse. But I think what is more important, and I said it very shortly, is the masculinization of space. This threat of control. So it's not like that you walk down the street and every day there's a policeman standing there. So like the map is actually showing that people can really say, okay, today there's a morality police station car standing in that square. It's not happening on a daily basis. They also have like patrols. But more than anything, it's a possibility of something happening to you. And I lived in Iran until the age of 28, and it is just a fact of feeling insecure in public spaces, that there is a possibility that you could be arrested. And when you're arrested, the kind of behavior you receive is really not nice. So you're taken to the police station, for example. Your family or your friends, whoever you have, should bring you proper clothes. And then you go through psychological consultation. They look into you're really treated like a criminal. And you have to do classes afterwards to be morally good, to be a good moral citizen. And then at the end, when you're leaving the station, you have to tear up your clothes with scissors. So that part really makes me laugh. It's like you have to, and a lot of women have tried to document these treatments in the police stations just to show how unjust this is and how unpleasant this is. So women try to avoid this kind of encounter with the moral police. And this is, as I said, this is more about masculinization of space rather than happening regularly or often. It's the randomness of it that makes it actually difficult.
Stephanie, would you like to respond at all to that or ask another question?
No, I think it's a very interesting, it's a very interesting point that she makes, and she's absolutely right. So, yeah.
Okay, thank you for your question. I don't have any other questions, but I have a question.
Mm-hmm.
I was wondering if you could expand a bit more on your critique of the universalist promises of surveillance theory and data justice theories. If you could go in a bit more detail about that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it's, for me, I'm coming from a very different background, and I did like sociology and gender studies, and I really started to read surveillance theories for my PhD project, and it was very interesting for me that for example, a lot of the theories, not at the moment, but let's say until 2005, 2000, are coming from a Foucauldian approach to surveillance. And the Foucauldian approach is interesting because it's very much Eurocentric. It doesn't mean it's wrong. It's a very interesting theory, but it is based on the liberal democratic relationship that people have in European or North American societies with their government. Although Foucault himself sort of differentiates between even German capitalism and French capitalism, and I think the American capitalism is a different story, but he is very specific about when he talks about panopticon and surveillance in that sense. And then you have surveillance in countries like China that is happening in a completely different political, sociocultural, economic background. And then you have all the countries of the Middle East, in Africa, that's completely different. And somehow the books that are written about this, they are not specifying what country they're talking about, or even what region, or even what political circumstances are involved in their analysis. And as I said, this was for me something that sort of did not reflect my experience of surveillance. And as you know, I started this Surveillance in the Global South research network exactly because of that at the end of my PhD project. So I'm hoping that more people are working on surveillance and how these technologies are localized in a very interlinked global, local relations of technological relations, political relations, and geopolitical relations, how these links are constructed and taken care of in different countries, especially in the countries of the Global South. So this research network, for example, has one conference coming up in September, and I'm really open, and I'm hoping that would start a discussion more in the surveillance studies. And I think in the paper on spatial data justice, I have also written about this discussion that, for example, even the theories of justice, and that's why Fraser's theory is interesting for me, because she talks about participation, and then the participation is not even possible? How could you think about data justice? And a lot of data justice theories are also theorized with the help of understandings of justice that are based on Western lived experiences or liberal democratic experiences. And I really think if we are going to move or transfer these theories to those contexts in the global south, we need to have fresh, maybe understandings of justice or surveillance. Yeah.
Thank you. We have a question in the chat by Rodrigo. Great presentation. Thanks, Azadeh. Quick curiosity. Do you think there has been or will be any kind of impact from the pandemic in these dynamics of surveillance in the Iranian context, since streets became less busy and people were spending more time online?
Yes, and I actually have written about this, which is a very good question. I asked myself, what happens now? And this paper is actually about authoritarian surveillance. And as I have put it there, a corona test, what happens to authoritarian surveillance. And it was very interesting for me because as the pandemic started, a lot of the Western countries that are very proud of their data protection policies, they started to look to China with envy in a sense. And there was always this national debate, at least in Germany, if they're doing the right thing, if we need that kind of system. And then there was this contact tracing application. There was all this international interesting discussions about what kind of good surveillance could be used during the times of pandemic. And the pandemic started in Iran right after really bloody demonstrations. 340 people were killed on the streets, 80 children amongst them. And at the time, the president of Iran said, we have facial recognition technologies in CCTV cameras. We would identify the people who have been involved in the demonstrations. The head of the police said, we can read the number plates of the cars. And they threatened people with all sorts of surveillance technologies. And I was sort of waiting, okay, now the pandemic starts and they are going to use these technologies. And interestingly, Iran did not use one single surveillance technology during the pandemic. And in this paper, I asked myself, why? And then part of the answer is really, as I tried to explain to Stephanie, a lot of these surveillance technologies are used as threat mechanisms. And they are more controlling systems rather than technological advancement, although the technological advancement is also there. But it used in small scales against political opposition. And when it goes to mass scales of bigger scales of mass surveillance of people, for example, during a pandemic, Iran doesn't have the infrastructure to do that. And the infrastructure doesn't mean just technological infrastructure, but also the human resources to have surveillance in such a scale. As a result, I also started to think, okay, what happens about schools in Iran? Can children have this school platforms on their mobile phones, computers, everything? And I started to look at not only Iran, but all the countries in the Economic Cooperation Organization, how they have developed these distance teaching and learning platforms. And it's quite interesting because in Iran, although they claim they have all this digital technologies and everything, almost 60% of school children did not have any access to these school platforms, or I think around 35% of them did not even have access to a digital device. So you see the country is very much unequal when it comes to digital access and to digital infrastructure. And during the time of pandemic, it became very visible that a lot of these technologies are targeted specifically to political opposition, but they cannot be used in a larger scale. I hope I answered your question.
Sorry, my microphone was muted. So, any other questions for Azadeh? I have another question.
Sure.
Would you say that the cybercrime legislation has enabled more surveillance in Iran?
So that's the thing in an authoritarian system, I would say. It is a very gray area. And in that discussion on authoritarian surveillance, I have tried to reflect on it, how authoritarian systems work and what kind of different authoritarian institutions are in play. And there is a kind of authoritarian system that looks from outside semi-democratic. So Iran has a parliament, it has all the ministries, everything. But at the end of the day, the intelligence officials and the supreme leader is in charge of everything happening in Iran. And in that gray area lies the foundation of a lot of decisions about important things. One of them, internet governance in Iran, and the governance of cyberspace. So the legislation in this system sort of provides a kind of background or seemingly lawful way of treating people who are not tolerated by the government. And as you can see, even in the legislation, if you want to look at it completely from a legal point of view, it is against the constitution, against the Iranian constitution, because it says content against officials and formal institutions are not allowed in the cyberspace, and that's against the Iranian constitution that says that people are free to express their minds. So as you can see, it's like a facade of regulations to cover a gray area that is very hard. You have a feeling as a political activist in Iran that you're fighting with the shadows, really, because you do not really know at the end of the day who is responsible for what. And even through my presentation, you could see that there are so many, even through this facade, there are so many organizations responsible for internet governance in Iran that even if you say, okay, people, let's have free access to Twitter, but you don't know where you should ask, like what kind of committee, which organization is actually really responsible for filtering Twitter. And people have really tried that. People have gone to the court and sued the telecommunication ministry and said why Twitter is filtered in Iran. Interestingly, the ministry says, I'm not the decision maker, they are the decision, and it goes on. So it is quite an interesting way of governing internet, I would say.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions? Yes, Bram.
Yes, hi, thanks for the presentation. I was wondering whether there was any reaction from the authorities to the Gershot application and to the White Wednesdays protests. What has been their reaction?
The Gershot application did not, was not very much, I would say, successful in the way that White Wednesday's campaign was successful. Because it's a lot of work probably for people to pinpoint all the police patrol stations, and so it is also possible for police officials to become a user of the application and start feeding wrong information to it. So it was a very interesting effort and a very creative way of doing it. But White Wednesday's campaign was a completely different story. It became fueled very much by the new generation of women that are fed up with these kind of regulations. So my generation, my mother has hijab, my grandmother had hijab, and we never had problems with each other. So it is not something that inside a family, you don't have this kind of controlling. I mean, in traditional families, like traditional Christian families, there is this tension between different generations. But in many other families, people did not really, even traditional people with religious backgrounds, did not really understand why hijab should be compulsory, because people have cohabited, women have cohabited with each other for a long time, and they have tolerated each other. So White Wednesday's campaign sort of started to express that kind of frustration and anger, and it became really successful. Especially women started to post photos. Their faces were not, at the beginning, a lot of people sent photos that their faces were not recognizable, and it became very popular. And the leader of the campaign is also a very active person, I would say. She did a lot of good international networking, and it became also internationally very, very relevant. And as soon as it became internationally well known, the Iranian government started to show really strict, like really bad reactions. And as I said, one of the activists, who was 21 years old, was sentenced to 24 years of imprisonment. So it is kind of a really harsh reaction to show. But it also started something that was very new. On a very normal, ordinary day, one woman climbed a electricity post in a very crowded street, and she took off her hijab, and she had a white flag in her hand. And she became the symbol of this movement, and that symbol was very strong. And a lot of women started to do the same thing. So they started to climb, funnily enough, always electricity posts in the streets, and they took off their hijab, and they didn't say anything. They just stood there until police arrested them. And this started to worry, I think, the officials in Iran, because men started to do the same thing, and it was started to become something very viral. And at this point, the government showed extreme reactions to this entire campaign. But as a feminist, for me, it is this regulation of female body and this regulation of urban space is very much integrated into the ideological thinking of the Iranian regime. So you would really think, why is it important at all? But it's that the control of female body is a fundamental concept in their understanding of how things work, the heterosexual family, the Islamic values in the family, and the kind of social understanding that they try so hardly to impose on people. And this campaign started to really, for the first time, physically resist against that. This is a new feminist movement, I would say, like a new wave of feminism in Iran, that women really physically started to distort the idea of properly hijab women at the public spaces through this campaign.
Bram, would you like to respond at all?
Yeah, thanks. So are they like actively looking for the people and trying to be really repressive, or are they just hoping it will pass? Or I was wondering how they are, really responding in the field, or.
So I think somebody has also written in the comments, I think it is very similar in most of the authoritarian systems. They set examples. It is really not realistic and possible and pragmatic to arrest all the people that are resisting one unjust thing. This, for example, this activist who was sentenced to 24 years of imprisonment is something that the parents of women, young women who try to resist, they would stop them from doing that. And they are like, what, are you going to spend the rest of your life in the prison? So this is something that other people, your parents, your family, would stop you from your activism. And as I said, the digital technologies and the surveillance technologies are very much used to target specific groups of people. So it is very recent that the Iranian government is arresting people. It used to be that they would come to your home at a very unpleasant time of the night, and you would be in shock and they would arrest you. But nowadays, they arrest people when they are driving on a highway, when they are in a park with their family, just to prove the point, we have your GPS data. So this is something that sort of setting an example that we know who you are, we know how to use these technologies. And like if you read, there is a lot of, I think, anthropological work done by Iranian activists, but for example, phishing emails that you receive as a political activist is always there. It's like you open your mailbox and you know that you receive phishing emails. Exactly. So yeah, they set examples.
Okay, Johannes has another question.
Yeah, so this is a historical question. I found it fascinating that internet surveillance started, according to your presentation, already in 2001, right, after protests in 1999. And in Russia, for example, you had a relatively free internet during that time still. So the Russian sovereign internet situation and the internet prohibition that starts around 2011 or 2013, like the Snowden revelations, they were very impactful in Russia. And so I wonder, did the Iranian regime also react to the Snowden revelations? Was there also like an attempt to localize data, for example, or to prevent US surveillance or anything of that kind?
No, interestingly not. They used Snowden revelations very much as a political campaign against the United States to show how terrible the United States is. But Iran has been very much involved, I would say, in cyber war with the United States and Israel specifically. And again, the attack against the nuclear facilities in Iran done by Israel through digital means it was the first time in the history of mankind that with a piece of code, they actually destroyed something physical. And this shows already how deep this war is between these countries. And I would say the normal people on the street, like the ordinary people on the street, they do not really know about these things. But the TV and like the official political campaigns really try to sort of highlight the unfairness of this entire cyber war. And they really also show themselves as being proud that they are resisting this American invasion of Iranian cyberspace. So there is a lot of political sort of back and forth discussion going on there. But the Snowden revelations, interestingly, I when I think about it now, it was very much used as a political campaign against how human rights violations actually happen in the United States, and they have no right of being advocates of democracy and human rights when something like that happens in their country. And it was very much in the Iranian media, but I don't think that there was a case that they actually showed reaction to the revelations that were related to Iran.
Okay, Johannes, you want to respond in any way or no?
No, I'm fine. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay. There's a question by Yasmin. Yasmin.
Hello.
Ansi.
Yes, hello.
Hi.
Hi, thank you so much for your talk. That's to start with. I don't really have a question, but I have a comment. My name is Yasaman. My mother is Iranian, and I'm really interested in this seminar. And I also applied for it just because I heard that it's about surveillance in Iran. So I'm studying a PhD at Sheffield Hallam University, and I'm looking into public reactions and understanding public reactions to law enforcement surveillance. But this takes everything into a whole new level. I just wanted to highlight one thing regarding the Iranian surveillance and authoritarian regime and how they try to oppress not just or impose restrictions not just on females. I just want to highlight something. It has nothing to do with the idea of hijab itself, because, for example, my mom is Iranian. She is not wearing the hijab for obvious reasons, because they made her kind of detest the whole concept of it. But because I was born in Iran, but we didn't stay there, I actually enjoyed, and I was engaged further in the concept of it. I liked it, I embraced it. I was the only one in my family to do so. And this shows the cohabitation between females of the same religion, even of the same sect, of the same nationality, but with completely different opinions. And that's the whole concept of freedom of opinion. So no one can tell you whether to wear it or not. And it extends beyond that in Iran, because I wear a proper hijab because I chose to. And when I go to Iran, they find other means to annoy me. Let's say whether or not I have nail polish, or whether or not I'm wearing open toe shoes. I've also been called, although I'm a foreigner there, okay, I was born in Iran, but I don't have a passport. Although I'm a foreigner there, I was asked to a police station once to justify why I have nail polish on my feet, on my toes, and why I'm wearing open toe shoes. So it really touches you on a deep level, whereby you don't want anyone to tell you what to do or how to wear, because that's something completely and completely sacred. You know, this is your freedom. So seeing such tremendous effort from someone Iranian who's obviously no longer living there, but trying to fight this even though remotely, it's just heartwarming. And I just wanted to tell you best of luck. And I hope your research and everything you've worked hard, obviously, to achieve reaches someone somewhere and lets them know that they're not forgotten over there. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Yeah, as I said, it is. I also grew up in a family. My mom has hijab. My grandma had hijab. I have 5 aunties, and 3 of them have hijab, 2 of them don't. It's a personal choice, and I think this entire campaign, it was also made it clear that it is against compulsory hijab, like imposing regulations on women. And as I said, I think it is that kind of controlling female body as an ideological foundation of the government. In the photo that I showed in that short part about the history of hijab regulations in Iran, you see one demonstration, and that was the 8th of March, the first 8th of March after the revolution, and there women actually went out on the streets and they tried to resist this new compulsory hijab regulations for everyone. And in that demonstrations, if you look at the old footage and documentations from them, there are hijabi and women without hijab. So it was important for everyone to establish, this is our choice, this is our body. We would make the choice if we want to have hijab or not, based on our own religious or spiritual or cultural understanding of hijab. But this is something that didn't go through. It has very many different reasons, but at the time, interestingly, a lot of women also did not receive support from their comrades in different groups, in different revolutionary groups, because they thought there are more important things to think about rather than women's hijab. And the regulation of female body is somehow always put out as, was not played out as a priority for revolutionary groups. And you can see after 40 years, you see how this is actually fundamental, how urban space is regulated, how family is regulated, how female bodies are regulated in the Iranian context.
Okay, I think if there's no other question, I think we will finalize here. And I'd like to thank you, Azadeh, for this really fascinating presentation and for opening up surveillance studies towards the global south. And let's hope we can have some interesting discussions at the Surveillance Studies Network conference in 22. I want to thank everyone who has come to this seminar for joining us. We will not have any seminars in the summer months, but we'll start again after the summer. Thank you.
Thank you very much for having me.
Bye-bye.